The day began like any other for the group of explorers. They were traveling through the thick forest, their boots crunching against dry leaves, their eyes sharp, scanning the unfamiliar terrain. The forest itself seemed alive, filled with strange calls of birds they had never heard before and the distant rustle of something large moving unseen. None of them could have imagined what they were about to encounter. They thought they were just mapping land and observing wildlife, but fate had a far greater story waiting for them. It happened without warning. The forest suddenly grew quiet, unnaturally quiet. The wind that had been stirring the trees a moment ago stilled, and the usual chatter of small creatures vanished. The silence pressed down like a heavy blanket, and the humans froze, instinctively sensing danger. Something was out there, something powerful. From the shadows of the towering trees, it appeared, the apex predator. Its body was massive, muscles rippling under a thick coat that gleamed in the fractured sunlight. Its eyes glowed with a strange intelligence, cold and sharp, fixed directly on the humans. Each step it took made the ground tremble slightly, and every breath it drew rumbled, like thunder in its chest. For most beings, seeing such a creature would have meant panic. It was the kind of predator that legends are built around, the kind mothers warned their children about, the kind that no weapon or trap could easily defeat. Its teeth were like curved blades, and its claws could shred through the toughest armor. For generations, this creature had been known as untouchable, the peak of nature's chain, a hunter with no equal. The explorers, though, did not run. Their hands tightened on their gear, but they did not lift their weapons. They knew one wrong move could turn the situation into disaster. But there was something deeper at work, too. Something that made humans different from the countless other species in the universe. They had learned, through thousands of years of struggle, that survival wasn't always about fighting harder or being stronger. Sometimes it was about reading the moment, understanding the mind of the opponent, and acting with patience. The predator stood still, watching them, its head tilted slightly, as if surprised by their reaction. Usually, prey scattered at the mere sight of it. Most creatures screamed, ran, or tried to strike first in desperation. These humans did none of those things. They stayed where they were, their breathing steady, their eyes locked onto its gaze. One of the explorers slowly raised, a hand, not with a weapon but open and empty, showing no threat. The gesture was simple, but it carried meaning. It was a signal older than words. "I am not here to fight." The predator blinked, a slow, almost curious movement. The air between them grew thick, heavy with tension. The predator lowered its body slightly, ready to pounce if it sensed weakness. Its muscles coiled like springs, its jaw twitching. But the humans didn't flinch. Instead, they shifted their stance, grounding their feet firmly in the soil as if saying, "We will not run. We are not afraid." Every second felt stretched, like time itself was holding its breath. The forest seemed to watch, too. Birds perched. Silently, small creatures hid in burrows. Even the wind waited. The predator's growl rumbled low, vibrating through the air. It was a sound designed to break courage, to make weaker creatures collapse in fear. But these humans, fragile compared to the beast, did not break. There was no shouting, no sudden movements, only calm, deliberate silence. One of the explorers reached into their pack, not for a blade, but for a strip of dried food. Slowly, carefully, they placed it on the ground and stepped back. The offering wasn't much, but it was a message. Where most species had only shown fear or hostility, humans showed something else entirely: respect. The predator's nostrils flared. It sniffed the air, head lowering toward the small piece of food. Its glowing eyes flicked back to the humans, as though weighing their intent. For creatures like this, trust did not come easily. It had spent its life as ruler of the wild, earning obedience through strength. But now it was being shown something new, something it had never seen before. The humans stood their ground, still and calm, their posture firm but non-threatening. The predator prowled closer, its massive frame casting a shadow over them. It moved with the grace of something born to hunt, each step a reminder of the power it held. Yet strangely, it did not strike. Instead, it sniffed at the offering, then glanced back at the silent group. Its breath washed over them in hot waves. Its teeth glistened. Every instinct screamed that this was the end, that no fragile creature could stand unarmed before such power and live. And yet, the predator hesitated. It was not hesitation born from confusion alone. It was something deeper. It was recognition. The predator saw that these small beings did not see it as just a monster to be slain, nor as prey to be devoured. They saw it as something greater, and in return they carried themselves as more than victims. They radiated a quiet defiance, a refusal to bow to fear. For the first time, this legendary predator found itself unsure. Minutes passed like hours. The predator circled them slowly, its tail sweeping the ground. It studied their movements, tested their reactions. At one point, it lunged forward suddenly, snapping its jaws just inches from the closest human. The force of the motion sent leaves flying, and the sound of its teeth clashing echoed like a crack of thunder. Any other creature would have stumbled, fallen, or screamed in terror, but the human did not move. Their body stayed rooted, their gaze steady. That was the moment everything changed. The predator drew back, its chest rising and falling, its eyes glowing with an expression that seemed almost thoughtful. It had tested their fear, but found none. It had tested their patience, but they did not break. What stood before it was not weak prey, but something far more dangerous. Beings who understood strength in a different way. The forest exhaled then, the silence breaking as the wind stirred through the leaves again. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called cautiously, as if asking if it was safe. The predator did not attack. It did not roar. Instead, it lowered its massive head, a movement so small yet so powerful that it sent a ripple of shock through the moment. The apex predator, the ruler of countless hunts, acknowledged the humans. It had not been defeated by blades or traps, but by something it had never experienced before: respect, patience, and courage. The humans remained still, letting the weight of the moment settle. They had survived the impossible, not by fighting, but by refusing to act like prey. And deep within the predator's glowing eyes, there was a flicker of something rare: respect. What began as an encounter with death had transformed into the beginning of an unspoken understanding. That day, the humans proved that strength was not always about who could strike hardest, but about who could stand firm when the world expected them to fall. It was only the beginning of their story, but even in that first meeting, one thing was certain: humanity had shown itself to be unlike any other. The encounter with the predator was not just a chance meeting in the forest. For generations, this creature had been a symbol, a shadow that lingered in every whispered story and every campfire tale. Long before the explorers ever stood face to face with it, its reputation had spread across valleys, mountains, and far-off settlements. People spoke of it in hushed tones, not daring to even say its name loudly, as though doing so might call it out of the dark. The predator had always been at the top of the chain. It was not simply feared because of its size or its sharp claws, but because of the long history it carried with it. Every village had its own version of the same warning: if the ground shakes and the forest grows silent, it is near. Hunters passed down stories of entire groups who had gone missing, their tracks ending abruptly where the predator's claw marks began. Farmers spoke of livestock disappearing overnight, dragged away without a sound. Children were taught from the very beginning to never wander too far, because the beast did not forgive mistakes. But what gave this predator its legendary status was not just its power, it was its intelligence. This was no mindless hunter that chased blindly. It knew how to wait, how to test, how to learn from every encounter. Stories told of how it would stalk its prey for hours, sometimes even days, watching patterns and weaknesses, until the strike was guaranteed. The way it hunted was said to be almost strategic, as though it understood more than it should. Travelers described glowing eyes in the night, following them from the shadows. Some said they heard low growls behind them, but never saw a shape, only to find claw marks carved deep into the trees by morning. To those who lived close to its territory, it was not simply an animal, it was a force of nature, as much a part of the land as the rivers and mountains themselves. What made matters worse was that no one had ever truly beaten it. Many tried. Brave hunters set out with spears, traps, and fire. Warriors marched into the forest with pride, certain that they could rid the land of its most feared terror. None of them returned. The predator always came back, unchallenged, untouched, more feared than before. Over time, it became more than just a creature. It was a legend, a reminder of nature's raw dominance. For most, the only hope was to avoid it entirely. To hear the silence of the forest fall meant it was already too late. When the explorers first heard these stories, they did not dismiss them as just tales. They listened closely. They knew that every myth usually carried a seed of truth. People did not invent fear like this out of nothing. It was born from real encounters, real danger. But they also believed that fear sometimes grew larger than the truth, passed from one tongue to another until the shadow it cast looked bigger than the source. Still, as they stood there in the forest facing the creature for the first time, they realized the stories had not exaggerated its presence. If anything, the stories had not done it justice. To see it in person was to understand why even the bravest hunters had chosen to remain silent when its name was spoken. The predator's reputation wasn't just about what it had done, but about what it represented. It was the reminder that, no matter how far humanity advanced, there were always forces greater than them, forces that could not be tamed by weapons alone. It was the embodiment of the wild, unbroken, and proud. And yet, despite this overwhelming weight of fear that generations had carried, the explorers approached it differently. They did not see themselves as challengers sent to kill it, nor as victims waiting for death. They saw an opportunity. Not an opportunity to destroy, but to understand. But to truly grasp what was happening in that silent forest, one had to understand the predator's reputation from the creature's perspective, too. For so long, it had been the ruler, the one who struck fear. Every creature fled from it. Every living thing bent to its power. It had learned that its presence alone was enough to control the outcome of any encounter. Fear was its greatest weapon, sharper than its teeth and more effective than its claws. Yet here were these humans, standing firm, their eyes steady, their bodies unshaken. They did not collapse under the weight of its reputation. They did not crumble at the stories others had told. They treated it not as an untouchable god of the forest, but as something living, breathing, and perhaps equal. That shift was powerful. For the predator, it was unsettling. For the humans, it was the moment they proved themselves different from all others. Around campfires later, the explorers would speak quietly among themselves about the long legacy of this predator. One of them would recall a story from a villager who claimed his grandfather had seen the creature pull down a wild beast twice its size in seconds. Another would remember the scarred tree trunks they passed earlier, each mark a signature left by the predator, as if it were writing its dominance into the very forest. And yet, despite all these terrifying reminders, what stuck with them most was the look in its glowing eyes when it hesitated. It was the first crack in the wall of reputation. For all its history, all its victories, and all its legends, the predator had shown a moment of thought, a flicker of recognition. The explorers began to wonder, had the stories of its brutality only told half the tale? Had no one ever considered that behind the glowing eyes and the terrifying growls, there might be something more? Perhaps the predator's reputation was only what others had chosen to see: fear, dominance, destruction. But now, with the humans standing their ground without violence, a different possibility was beginning to appear. It was as though, for the first time in its long history, the predator had been met not with terror, but with respect. And in that exchange, its reputation shifted, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed. It was no longer just the terrifying ruler of the forest. It became something greater, a being capable of choice, capable of seeing beyond the simple rule of fear. The world would continue to tell stories about this predator for years to come. Villagers would still warn their children not to wander too far. Travelers would still whisper about glowing eyes in the shadows. But those who knew the truth of that encounter would remember it differently. They would remember the day when humans did not fall to fear, when they faced a legend and did not raise a weapon. They would remember the day when the predator's reputation, built over generations, met something stronger than claws or fangs: human resolve. And though the predator still roamed the land, carrying with it the same raw power it always had, its story had gained a new chapter. No longer was it only the beast that no one could defeat. It was now also the creature that bowed its head, not to violence, but to courage. That was the weight of its reputation, and the beginning of how it changed forever. The predator had always been met in one way: fear. From the beginning of its reign, every living thing that crossed its path responded with the same instinct: run, fight, or hide. To the animals of the forest, it was untouchable. To the villagers nearby, it was unstoppable. No one ever thought to deal with it in any way other than aggression or terror. But when humanity finally stood face to face with it, something different happened. Instead of drawing weapons, instead of trying to drive it away with fire or traps, the humans did the unexpected. They stood still. They watched. They acknowledged its presence without shrinking back. That moment, though it seemed simple, was unlike anything the predator had experienced before. It was used to the trembling of prey, the panic of hunters, the desperate clatter of spears. But these humans carried themselves differently, almost as though they had come not to destroy, but to speak in a language older than words. Humanity's unusual approach began with patience. Where others would have struck fast or fled instantly, the humans did neither. They allowed silence to stretch, allowed the predator to circle them, and in that silence, something shifted. The forest itself seemed to lean in, watching the strange meeting. The trees stood motionless, the air thick with a stillness that carried weight. What made humans different was their understanding that strength did not always come from claws or weapons. It often came from restraint. They understood the power of not reacting in panic. While the predator tested them, growling low and pacing just beyond reach, they did not give in to fear. They showed that they recognized its dominance without collapsing under it. And that balance, acknowledgement without submission, was something no other creature had ever shown. At first, the predator did not understand. Its instincts told it that this was a challenge. Why weren't they running? Why weren't they raising their weapons? Why were they simply holding their ground with steady eyes? Confusion is not an emotion it was used to, but the predator felt it. For the first time in countless encounters, its certainty was shaken. Humans have always carried with them something that sets them apart: imagination. They don't simply react, they think, they plan, they look for paths unseen. And in this forest, standing before a legend, that imagination came alive. Instead of asking, "How do we kill it?" they asked, "What if we don't?" That simple question shifted everything. One of the explorers slowly reached into their pack, not for a blade, not for fire, but for food. A piece of dried meat, humble and small compared to the giant before them, was set gently on the ground. It was not tossed, not thrown as bait. It was placed as an offering, a gesture. To the predator, it was puzzling. For a creature that had always taken by force, to be given something freely was unheard of. It didn't move at first, suspicious of the act. But the humans did not push. They waited. This patience, this refusal to rush, was humanity's weapon. The one no one else had ever used. The predator eventually lowered its massive head, sniffed, and with a single swipe of its tongue, took the offering. The humans didn't move. They didn't chase it off or try to use the moment to strike. They let it happen. For generations, the predator had built its reputation on the idea that it could not be faced without violence. Yet here was proof that it could. Not by overpowering it, but by meeting it in a different way, through understanding. Day after day, the explorers returned. Each time, they repeated the same quiet ritual. They never tried to cage it, never tried to force it closer. They simply offered food, a calm presence, and most importantly, respect. Slowly, the predator began to learn that these humans were unlike any it had known. It no longer circled them with growls. It no longer tested their fear. Instead, it began to watch them the way they had watched it, curious, cautious, waiting to see what came next. Humanity's unusual approach was not about conquering the predator. It was about rewriting the relationship between them. Where others saw a monster, they saw a mind. Where others saw danger, they saw possibility. That shift in perspective changed everything. The predator had ruled through fear, but now it was experiencing something new: trust. And though it resisted at first, trust has a way of growing when it is nurtured. The humans did not take shortcuts. They did not assume victory after one encounter. They built it step by step, showing again and again that they came without malice. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the predator snarled, when its old instincts rose up. There were times when the humans felt the weight of its power pressing down on them so strongly that their legs trembled. But they held steady, knowing that fear was exactly what had always fed its dominance. By refusing to let fear control them, they began to reshape the predator's expectations. The unusual approach also came from humanity's ability to communicate without words. They didn't speak the predator's language, but they spoke through body language, through tone, through the quiet choice to remain calm. They never met aggression with aggression. Instead, they responded with stillness, with patience, with the simple presence that said, "We do not come to harm you." Over time, something remarkable happened. The predator stopped seeing them as prey. It stopped testing them as threats. It began to treat them as something new, an equal presence in its territory. That transformation was not only rare, it was historic. Back in the villages, people would find it difficult to believe. How could a creature that had ruled with terror be calmed by anything other than violence? But the explorers had lived it. They had seen the moment the predator's eyes softened, the moment its growl faded into silence, the moment it sat rather than stalked. They had witnessed the beginning of a new bond, not of dominance, but of respect. This was humanity's unusual approach: to refuse the easy path of violence, to embrace patience in the face of danger, and to build trust where none had ever existed. In doing so, they uncovered something powerful. They discovered that sometimes The greatest strength does not come from proving you can destroy, but from proving you don't need to. And though the predator was still an apex force of the forest, its story had changed forever. No longer was it just the terror of the wild. It had become the creature that listened, that chose to pause, that recognized in humanity a reflection of something more. The humans had not defeated it, but they had done something greater. They had tamed the space between fear and understanding. And in that space, both the predator and humanity found something new: peace. The predator had grown used to the presence of the humans. Where once it had seen them as intruders or prey, now it saw them as something else, unpredictable, yet strangely steady. It had taken food from them, circled them without fear, and begun to understand that their presence was not like the others who had tried to challenge it. But the forest was still the predator's world, and in its world, nothing was ever given freely. Trust was not won by gifts alone. It was tested. Tested in silence. Tested in moments when nothing moved, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. This was the stage where the predator would decide whether these humans truly belonged in its territory, or whether it would finally unleash the full force of its nature. The humans understood this, though no words were exchanged. They felt it in the way the predator no longer rushed forward, the way it stood at a distance, eyes locked, waiting. It was a kind of challenge without motion, a silent test. For hours, neither side moved. The predator crouched low, its golden eyes fixed on the group, its muscles tensed but still. The humans did not flinch. They sat quietly, their weapons untouched, their movements calm, as if they had all the time in the world. The forest grew heavy around them. Birds stopped singing, insects quieted. Even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb the moment. It was as though the entire world was watching to see who would break first. This was the test, not of strength, but of patience. Could the humans endure the pressure of its gaze? Could they survive the weight of being watched by a predator who, at any second, could end them? Most creatures failed here. Fear always broke them. Animals bolted. Hunters reached, too quickly for weapons. But these humans, these strange beings who offered food instead of war, remained still. Time dragged on. The predator's tail twitched. The humans exchanged no words, only glances. Their breaths were slow, controlled, measured. Sweat formed on their brows, but none of them let their fear rule their body. Their stillness was louder than any roar, stronger than any show of muscle. Slowly, the predator stood tall. Its massive head tilted, its ears flicked, and it stepped closer. The ground trembled beneath its paws, and with each step, the humans felt their hearts pound harder. But still, they did not move. It was not submission. It was resolve. They had chosen to pass this test, no matter the risk. The predator drew so close that they could feel its breath, hot and sharp against their skin. Its eyes narrowed, its nose twitched as it inhaled their scent. One of the humans felt a low growl vibrate through the air, so deep it rattled in their chest. For a moment, it seemed the predator would strike. But when no fear poured from them, when no sudden movements betrayed panic, the growl faded. Instead, the predator did something unexpected. It sat. Right there, only a few paces away, it lowered its massive body to the ground, resting but still, watchful. It had set the rules of the test, and the humans had accepted them. By neither fleeing nor forcing the encounter, they had proven themselves. But the test was not over. Silence continued, heavy as stone. The humans realized that this was about more than fear, it was about intent. The predator was searching for something deeper, something instinct could not measure. Were these humans truly harmless? Or were they hiding the same greed that every other hunter carried? So the humans showed the predator their truth, not through words, but through small, steady actions. One of them reached slowly into their pack, not with haste but with care, pulling out another piece of food. This time it was not set at a distance. This time it was placed closer, halfway between them and the predator. Then the human pulled back, hands open, palms visible, a gesture as old as time that said, "I carry no threat." The predator's ears flicked forward. Its nose caught the scent, and it rose again, padding closer until it stood at the center point. With a soft chuff, it sniffed, then lowered its great head to claim the offering. Its sharp teeth could have ended the humans' life with one snap, but instead, they brushed gently against the ground, lifting the food without harm. The humans did not move, did not reach, did not try to touch. They let the predator decide. That was the real test. Would they try to control it, or would they let it remain free? The answer came in the stillness of their hands, in the quiet of their bodies. The predator ate, then looked up. For the first time, its gaze was not hard or calculating. It was searching, almost curious. Hours later, when the predator finally turned and walked back into the shadows of the forest, the humans exhaled together. They knew something had shifted. They had not tamed it, not yet, but they had earned a place in its eyes as something more than prey. They had passed the silent test. The forest seemed to breathe again once the predator vanished. Birds called out once more, leaves rustled in the wind, and the weight that had pressed down on the humans lifted. Yet none of them celebrated loudly. They understood what had just happened. They had been measured, not in strength, but in patience, in respect, in restraint. And they had been found worthy enough for the predator to walk away without blood. That night, as they sat by their fire, none of them spoke much. Words felt too small for the weight of the day. But in their silence, they carried the knowledge of what had been won. Trust in its first fragile form. The predator would return again. That much they knew. The silent test was not a one-time event. It was a beginning. Each encounter would be another question, another challenge, and humanity would need to keep proving again and again that their strength was not in dominance, but in understanding. But on that day, something rare and beautiful had taken root. A predator that once ruled only through fear had given its first nod of respect. And humanity, through nothing more than patience and presence, had taken its first step toward rewriting the story of what it meant to face an apex predator. Fiercest, Forest remembered that day. The humans remembered it. And perhaps, in its own way, the predator remembered too. Because deep down in the quiet language of survival, a bond had begun to form, one that would change everything that followed. The predator returned days later. The humans had almost expected it, though they still felt their breath catch when they saw its shadow stretching between the trees. It came silently, like a ghost of the forest, its massive form moving with such ease that even the wind seemed careful not to disturb it. But this time its presence felt different. The first time had been about dominance, the second about survival, the third a silent test. Now something else carried in the way it walked. Its steps were slower, more deliberate, its eyes no longer sharp with suspicion but steady with curiosity. The humans stood together, just as they had done before. No weapons raised, no fear shown. Their calm was not forced now. It was genuine. Days of waiting, of watching the predator's movements from a distance, had made them realize something important. The creature did not want mindless submission, and it did not want blind obedience. It wanted recognition. It wanted respect. As it drew closer, the air thickened with tension, but not the same kind as before. This was not the weight of danger pressing down. This was the weight of choice. The predator was deciding whether the humans had truly earned their place in its world. It stopped only a few paces away, close enough for its breath to warm the cool air between them. Its head lowered slightly, and for a moment, the humans thought it was preparing to lunge. Muscles tensed instinctively, but none of them moved. Instead, they remained still, their eyes meeting its gaze, their bodies open and unguarded. What happened next was so unexpected that it took their minds a moment to catch up. The predator bent lower, lowering its massive body until its head nearly touched the ground. Its golden eyes never left theirs, but its posture changed completely. This was no attack stance. It was something else, something older than words, older than human history itself. It was a bow, slow, deliberate, undeniable. The apex predator, ruler of the forest, had bowed to the humans. At first, no one breathed. The sight was too unreal, too heavy with meaning. This was a creature that feared nothing, challenged everything, and yet here it was, lowering itself, in acknowledgement of those who had once been strangers in its land. The humans did not cheer. They did not rush forward or break the moment with noise. Instead, they responded in the only way that felt right. Together, they bent their heads forward, mirroring the predator's bow. It was not rehearsed, not planned. It simply happened, as naturally as breathing. For a long, silent moment, predator and humans faced each other in mutual respect. No chains bound them, no force compelled obedience, no fear drove them apart. What bound them was something far stronger, recognition of each other's strength, endurance, and will. The predator rose again, taller than all of them, its shadow stretching wide. But this time, the weight it carried was no longer threatening. It circled once, its movements calm, almost protective, before settling a short distance away. The humans watched in awe. They understood what had taken place. This was not just survival. This was not just coexistence. This was acceptance. The predator had chosen to recognize them as more than fragile creatures who stumbled into its forest. It had chosen to see them as equals. That night, when the humans sat by their fire, they spoke softly among themselves. Their words were careful, almost reverent, because they knew they had witnessed something few would ever believe. They had not tamed the predator. They had not broken it or bent it to their will. Instead, they had earned its respect through patience, restraint, and understanding. The bow of respect was more than a gesture. It was a turning point, a moment that would ripple through every future encounter. From that day on, when the predator appeared, there was no fear. It walked among them with ease, sometimes watching, sometimes resting nearby. It never became tame, never lost its wild edge. But the humans no longer needed it to. They realized something powerful in that moment. The true strength of humanity was not in conquering nature, but in learning how to live alongside it. They could build, create, invent, and fight when needed. But what set them apart was their ability to understand, to connect, to turn even a predator's suspicion into trust. Days turned into weeks, and the humans continued to meet the predator. Sometimes they offered food. Other times they simply sat in its presence, their silence speaking louder than words. The predator no longer tested them with growls or challenges. Instead, it watched with quiet acceptance, its head lowering slightly each time it appeared, as though reminding them of the respect it had once shown. For the humans, it was a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Power was not always about who was stronger. Sometimes, power came from patience, from restraint, from the courage to stand still when every instinct screamed to run. The bow of respect became a story they would tell again and again, not as a tale of dominance, but as a reminder of what humanity could achieve when it chose understanding over violence. In that single moment, the predator had acknowledged them, not because they forced it, but because they proved themselves worthy. And deep in the forest, the predator carried the memory as well. For in the ancient language of the wild, a bow was not weakness. It was recognition, and once given, it was never forgotten. The humans and the predator would always remain different, walking separate paths. But the bond formed in that bow created something rare. Harmony without chains, respect without fear, and peace without surrender. And so, the apex predator, feared by all, had chosen to lower its head to humanity. Not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. And humanity, in turn, had bowed back, not in submission, but in respect. The forest was never the same again. Neither were the humans. Because on that day, the predator did not just bow. It taught humanity that the greatest victories are not won by force, but by understanding.